1, 2. Yeah.
Ningepata tu sehemu to DLS waifutible to connect. Usiende nje Dawin, kuja huko. Kuja tukae hapa hivi. Yes. Mhm.
Yoda sema I didn't know. Yoda sema I didn't know.
Not what?
I didn't know.
Yes, nimesikia.
Hello guys.
Wasiniuta.
Richard, Richard.
Sijui nani ananiita.
We mute bwana. Ni nini?
Wewe mute bana, tutaki kuona hiyo sura yako bana. Mute
Ya
mic.
kwenda kwa nani?
Na video pia. Wewe
Kwenda.
mchezo.
Wewe msee, wewe umemute. Umemute wewe.
Wewe ni leo.
Hayo sura bwana.
Order.
Unataka oda ipatikane wapi? Wewe kwenda huko.
Umemaliza yote? Haya.
Mister. Just mute yourself.
For those who are not able to mute, I'm just going to remove you from this class. It is embarrassing to see a second year just want to shout in an online lesson.
Ongea. naongea na yeye, naongea na
So members, let us start our class. So today, being on Wednesday, 16th of November, 2024, we are going to continue with our unit, State, Society, and Development. Hey,
to conduct its business in an open manner, and that its sittings and those of its committees shall be open to the public. The hearing of the proposed removal from in this particular hearing has facilitated members of the public present.
so characteristics of the nation. One, the nation was an entity more or less identified by boundaries. Unajua nimeamute. Nimeunmute. That's 192.
Hello, good morning, class. Welcome to our today's lesson. I'm sorry for the delay. We were to begin as early as 11, but because of the logistical issues, we have delayed. But otherwise, you are welcome on board for today's class. Now, last week, we did not have our class also because of some commitments. But we were able to do our online class. It's unfortunate that a good number did not do that online and submit the online cut and submit. I want to request that as we had agreed last time, we shall be having online cuts on Wednesday from 5 to 6. I don't know if you are getting me, class. Am I clear to all of us?
Yeah, we are getting you, sir.
Okay, thank you. Okay,
Yes,
thank
yes.
you. Okay, so I'm requesting that kindly make sure that you partake of those cards. Today we shall have another one, but that one will be out of just 5 marks. So we shall have 5 questions today. So it will not be tedious like what we had last time. So I'm requesting that you log in on time and attempt those 5 questions in the evening from, I think it will be from 5 to 6. and it will be drawn from what we learned last week and previously on nation states in Africa. Now today, what we are going to learn basically, class, it's not new to us because I introduced it last time in our previous lesson when I was teaching about the origin and development of nation states in Africa. And in tracing the origin of nation states, I mentioned about the European colonization of Africa that marked the onset of nation states in Africa. Now, basically today, our topic, I think, should be number 5. It's about European colonization of Africa. And we shall do the basics. I know I'm not teaching historians only. I know on board we have engineers, we have those other cadres on board. And therefore, this course is not supposed to scare you. And therefore, I won't make it that way historical. But I'll just lay the basis. So that, remember, this course is just meant to equip you, give you some basics about our history, so that if you're not doing history as a core course, it's important that you have the basics, the history of Africa. And therefore, maybe to those ones who are taking history as a core course in the undergraduate, they might find that we are doing it shallowly because they have other courses that are related to this, which they do it in a deeper way than what we are doing here. But then this is not purely history, but it's just important that we go through this course about the history of Africa. Now, to start with, basically, the European colonization of Africa began way back in, and of course, we should be looking at the motivations, what motivated the Europeans to come and colonize Africa. But there are some basics, there are reasons as to why these people developed interest to come and colonize Africa. And basically it emanated from the Industrial Revolution in Europe. Now, Industrial Revolution, remember before the Industrial Revolution, we had what we call the cottage industry. The processing and the manufacturing of goods were done manually. And that is why they had, during the Agrarian Revolution, they entirely relied on human labor. But by the 18th century, around 1822, the European countries, and more specifically Britain, had taken off in terms of industrialization. And 1820, it moved from the cottage industry, from reliance on human labor, to the industries, the use of machines, and thereby the growth of industries. And in so doing, initially, the products that were being produced by human labor were of low quantity. But with the use of machines, Britain was able to process goods faster and in large quantities. And therefore, class, there was need for sufficient and constant supply of raw materials. Now, at that time, by 1820, Britain enjoyed the monopoly of natural resources that existed in Europe. And remember that Britain had also formerly colonized America. And therefore, Britain used to acquire raw materials from America and also from within the entire of Europe. But as time went by 1850, France joined the race and it became industrialized. And therefore, there was the issue of the competing factor again came in now. Because now France also was competing for the raw materials that were there in Europe. In the year 1871, there was a war that was fought between France and Germany. For the historians, it's called the Franco-Prussian War. In this Franco-Prussian War that ended in the year 1871, Germany defeated France in this war. And in so doing, remember before this war, Germany was not a united nation, but it was just composed of different states. But after the end of the Franco-Prussian War, there was what we call the unification of Germany. And then, therefore, Germany also came up as a united country and as a country that had also realized industrialization. And therefore, the competing force again, in a way, also came into action. And Germany now complicated the whole story about the competition for raw materials in Europe. And in so doing, class, I hope you're getting me. Is it okay from your side, class?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
So in so doing, German in a way complicated again the superiority of these two countries, that is Britain and France. And remember, after this war, France was humiliated. And what German did, German accused France of having caused the war. And what were the repercussions? They fined France to pay what we call an indemnity of over 150 million. That is sterling pounds. That was a lot of money. Number two, Germany took over very important provinces that belonged to France. They are called Alsace and Lorraine. These two provinces were very important to France because they were endowed with iron ore, and coal. Remember, this was the era of industrialization. And countries in Europe entirely depended on coal for purposes of course, driving the engines in machines or industries. Now, when Germany took over these two provinces that belonged to France, and remember, they had already now fined them, they were supposed to pay. They were supposed to pay within 10 years. So France was humiliated, and it sought to, one, regain its superiority, be stable again in Europe, and of course repay the money that was funded by Germany, and it was a lot of money. Now, and remember, this is the era of industrialization. So what happened was that France had to seek a way to raise money so that they can repay German. Number two, of course, to remain stable economically. And number three, to compete with other European nations. Already we mentioned Britain, of course, now Germany and France itself. But we had also other upcoming countries like Italy and Belgium. Now, with the competing forces in Europe, France decided to seek refuge to Africa. And it came specifically in Egypt. Why? And the reason, they wanted to get the raw materials so that they can now produce a lot, sell and repay German. But there were competing factors again in Egypt between the French and Britain. And later on, and I don't want to delve into that, the historians know about what we call the Egyptian question. This was the fight over taking over Egypt because of the Suez Canal. Remember, Britain wanted to colonize the Far East, that is Asia, the countries in Asia. And therefore they had an interest in Egypt. That is why they took over Egypt and displaced the French again. This is what is called the Egyptian question. When the French were displaced in Egypt, that is in Africa, they went to West Africa and Central Africa. And the Britain or the British was scared that the French will take over other spheres of influence in Africa. Remember, when you talk about Egypt, you cannot fail to talk about the River Nile. In history, we say that the Nile, Egypt is the Nile, and the Nile is Egypt. But then the question is, where is the source of River Nile? The source of River Nile is in Uganda. And the British, having displaced the French, and the French had gone to Central Africa, they were a bit worried that the French will overtake them and take over. Somebody is asking which topic is this? I hope we are doing topic 5. Is it European colonization of Africa? European colonization of Africa that comes immediately after the states, nation states in Africa. I hope that is clear, students. And therefore, to control Uganda, the British had to come to Kenya. The entry to Uganda from the Indian Ocean they had to, of course, acquire Kenya first, then go to Uganda. And remember, the River Nile passes Sudan before it enters Egypt. That is how the British came to Kenya, Uganda, conquered Sudan, and later on Egypt. Now, there is a reason as to why I'm laying this foundation for us to understand. Somebody is asking if I can share the screen. Whatever I have, I don't know if that is important for you. Let me see if I can share my screen. But already you have these notes. Let me see if I can share. But even if I share, there isn't much in what I'm sharing here. I think the notes I send you, just hold on, please. Hold on, let me see if I can share.
I know that I'm going to go in for it again.
Maksud lakini wakifanya hivi dai ni pesa da dai mwenye tumeviana
Article 147(1) of the Constitution provides that
Welcome back. We had a technical hitch from our side, but we are back. So welcome. So class, we had stopped at where Britain had claimed or had an interest in Kenya, Uganda, Sudan, and of course, Egypt. But basically, her interest, that is Britain, her interest was in Egypt. And as I told you previously, you cannot control Egypt minus the River Nile, because Egypt itself is a desert, and it entirely depends on River Nile. So when the French were displaced and defeated in Egypt, they wanted to revenge by taking over Uganda so that they can punish, because now they'll be controlling the waters of the Nile. But the British were so brave that they came to Kenya, declared their interest in Kenya. They occupied Uganda, being Lake Victoria being the source of River Nile, and they occupied, also declared an interest in Sudan, therefore controlling Sudan to Egypt. Now, why am I laying this background for us to understand? Remember, I started with the Industrial Revolution. It is Industrial Revolution that marked the backbone of European colonization of Africa, because the processing of raw materials in Britain is the one that made these people to run to Africa. And that is why we are seeing now coalitions. As these countries were industrializing in Europe, there was a competing force over the available resources. I've already told you how Germany took over the very key resources, provinces that belonged to France, punishing France again. And therefore, when France began to run to Africa, Britain came in action. And just to maybe see how the coming of France opened a way, or the eyes of the Europeans, to run to Africa. France, when it came to Africa, within 5 years, remember, I had told you that they were to repay the the cost of the war within 10 years, that was 150 million sterling pounds. This meant that France was to repay Germany in 10 years. But within 5 years, in history we are told, France had acquired a lot of resources, a lot of capital from Africa. And they were able to repay within 5 years. And this came as a surprise to many European nations because they could not imagine that France could repay within 5 years. And now this one opened the eyes of many European nations, and they discovered that Africa indeed is endowed with unexploited resources, which were now required in Europe for processing. Now, because of the Industrial Revolution that had taken shape in Europe, they received reports. Remember, before colonization, we had the exploration era and the missionary era. Remember explorers like David Livingstone, missionaries, people like Rebman, Ludwig Kraft. We had traders, they came to Africa. And when they came to Africa and crisscrossed the continent of Africa, they wrote reports back to their mother countries that sent them and told them that, lo, Africa indeed is endowed, and especially those ones who crisscross the central of Africa, like David Livingstone wrote back to his mother country and said that the Central Africa indeed has a lot of raw materials, minerals that have not been exploited. And that is why we saw Belgium came into force under King Leopold II. So when they started rushing to Africa to acquire different parts of Africa, this is what brought to what we call the scramble of Africa. Now, when you talk about scramble of Africa, what do we mean? To scramble means that haphazard way of running to Africa to acquire without any formula. Like the French just came to Africa, wanted to acquire some regions in West Africa, in Central Africa, in East Africa, in North Africa. Then Britain also came into force. Belgium came into force. Countries like Italy also came. Spain also came, among others. So when they came, there was that rush of acquiring different parts of Africa, depending on the raw resources or raw materials that existed. And this brought about what you call the scramble of Africa. Students, just like when you throw a bone to a number of dogs in your home, you know what happens? The rush for that bone is what we refer to as the scramble. So that is how the European countries scrambled for different parts of Africa as a continent. And in so doing, this process was called the scramble for Africa. Now, this scramble was not organized. It was disorganized, haphazard way of sharing Africa. And in so doing, these European countries started claiming one territory or one area, and therefore they started quarreling over one maybe sphere of influence. just like, for example, I've just mentioned of how the French and the British fought over the acquisition of Egypt. So what is referred to as the Egyptian question. And because of these competing forces over acquisition of different parts of Africa, there is one person known as Otto von Bismarck. Otto von Bismarck was the then Chancellor of Germany. He looked at how the European countries were scrambling for Africa and said, no, we are the elites of the world. We should not run and scramble for this Africa. And he thought of this very important way. He called for a meeting in Europe, specifically in Berlin. And the Berlin is the capital city of Germany. This meeting was held in Berlin between November 1884 to February 1885. The meeting was therefore referred to as the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885. Very important meeting. And therefore this meeting, the purpose of this meeting was to share the continent of Africa amongst the European countries that had developed the competing interests in Africa. I've already mentioned some of the countries that had developed interest, starting with Britain, the first one to industrialize, France, Belgium, which one else? Italy, among others. And even Germany itself. And therefore, this man, Otto von Bismarck, was very brave. And he said, we are the elites of the world. Can you come, let us share this Africa around the table? So he called these European nations, and they sat around the table. In this very important meeting or conference, imagine it was held between November, that is November, December, January, February 1885. 4 good months. And what were these people discussing? They were discussing on how to share this continent called Africa amongst themselves. And therefore, they came up after that meeting, that is in February 1885, they came up with the terms of the treaty. The terms of the treaty, I don't know if it is here, you know, I'm just teaching from my own history. I don't know if it's here, there is the Industrial Revolution. The competing nations are here. I hope you have seen them. Of course, we had Britain, we had Belgium, we had France, we had Germany, among others. But we are saying that by the end of this conference, the Berlin Conference in 1885, February, they came up with the resolutions, historically referred to as the terms of the treaty. Now, just in a nutshell, to mention 1 or 2 of them that marked now the process, the onset of European colonization of Africa. One was that any European country that developed interest to colonize any part of Africa, then it has to notify the rest. That was the first agreement or term of the treaty. That any country that wants to take over any part of Africa, then it has to notify the rest. Number 2, that If then you declare an interest in any part of Africa, then this declaration, remember these areas in Africa were referred to as spheres of influence. So they said that if you declare any sphere of influence in Africa, then this declaration must be followed with effective occupation. That you declare and you take over. Just like for gents on the wall here in class, when you declare an interest over a lady, you immediately occupy. I don't know if that is the case, I don't know. But that was an agreement that was reached upon in the Berlin Conference, that you declare the first one, and this declaration of the spheres of influence then must be followed with what we call effective occupation. You occupy that particular area. Another one, the third one, which is also very important, was that then this effective occupation was followed with what we call establishment of administrative systems, European administrative systems. And number 4 was that we had major rivers like River Congo, River Niger in the west, River Nile. They were declared free for navigation. That, for example, if you declared Congo as a sphere of influence, that European country could not prohibit other European countries that wanted to access the interior of Africa via the River Congo or River Niger or even River Nile. So the major rivers in Africa were declared free for navigation for any European country, among other resolutions. Now, this Berlin Conference now formed the onset of European colonization of Africa. How? By setting a formula of how they could declare different spheres of influence in Africa, and thereby following with what we call effective occupation. And in so doing, class, these European countries started putting demarcation. That if you declare sphere of influence, then you have to demarcate that particular sphere of influence. The demarcation, the drawing of boundaries, is what now interfered with the pre-colonial nations that we learned about. Our topic number 1, remember that before the coming in of the Europeans, we had what existed was what we call the pre-colonial nations. So these Europeans, when they came and declared different parts of Africa as their spheres of influence and started drawing the boundaries to mark their spheres of influence, they did not take into account the existing pre-colonial nations. And that is why, as they drew these boundaries, class, they were able to subdivide, to bring together, to amalgamate. And you remember when we were defining the term nation state, we said these were the amalgamation of what were the pre-colonial nations put together to form a nation state like Kenya. And this one, they did not take into consideration the pre-colonial nations that existed. Instead, they were just merged together, thereby creating what we call the nation states. And that is why some pre-colonial nations like the Maasai, some of them were left in Tanzania, that was Tanganyika and Kenya, the Sebei of Uganda and Kenya, like that. So this procedure or organized way of now sharing Africa after what we call the Berlin Conference is what is referred to as the partition of Africa. Remember the first one, the first process was the scramble for Africa, the disorderly manner of sharing countries of Africa without no formula, the haphazard way of doing it. But here now we have the organized formula, the organized form of acquisition of different parts of Africa. This is referred to as the partition of Africa. Now, generally, it is the entire process is referred to as the scramble and partition of Africa. Class, up to that point, I have laid the background of the European colonization of Africa, starting with, you know, even in an exam you can ask that for example, a question can be posed to us that Industrial Revolution marked the beginning of European colonization of Africa. Discuss. How did it do that? And that is what we are going to look at. Of course, I've laid the foundation of how it brought about the European colonization. Class, allow me move to what we refer to as the European motivation of colonizing Africa. Indeed, what now led to European colonization of Africa? There were a number of reasons, and for historians, they usually classify them as economic, as social, as political. But in this class, we shall just mention a few of them for purposes of learning. Now, remember here, we are looking at the reasons for colonization. These reasons are also referred to as the motivations of European colonization of Africa. Now, the major reason was pegged on the Industrial Revolution. Remember, the industries required the raw materials. So what was the first motivator or motivation for European colonization of Africa was the need for raw materials. Where were these raw materials? Yes, they existed in Europe, but because of the competing forces in Europe, another alternative continent that provided unexploited resources was Africa. And this and raw materials included rubber, ivory, sugarcane, tobacco, oil, palm oil, cotton, among others. So the major reason for European colonization of Africa class was the search for raw material, the need, the requirement of the raw materials to feed in their industries. Industries were mushrooming in Europe that required raw materials for processing. So what happens when you acquire now the raw materials and process? Number two reason or motivation for European colonization of Africa was to look for markets for their goods, because now they were processing. These commodities or these finished products were supposed to be sold. And in Africa, we didn't have the machinery. So we provided the large market that was required for the finished products. So they came to secure markets for their finished products. Number three factor or motivation was to look for areas for reinvestment, because when you process the raw materials and you get the finished products and you sell, you get the profit, you get the surplus capital. Where do you take this? You have to look for areas for reinvestment. And therefore, Africa offered such areas for reinvestment. So they came, the third motivation was for places of reinvestment. Apart from that, now the reinvestment process brought about the need to protect their businesses. And that was the fourth motivation, to protect their wealth, their investments in Africa. Apart from this, we are talking about the fertile soils that existed in Africa, where they wanted to do farming. Now, another reason for another motivation was the explosion of population in Europe. During the Industrial Revolution, people produced a lot of products, and especially the food products. And what happens when people eat a lot? The tendency of producing goes up. And therefore, there was this explosion of population in Europe that needed to be exported elsewhere. And Africa provided such, because by then, Africa was not overpopulated, and therefore it provided room for surplus population in Europe. Apart from this, we had other factors, political factors, like the competition for power. Nations in Europe competed for power. And to show that they were powerful, this was exhibited by the number of colonies. The number of colonies. Remember, these spheres of influence are what we refer to as today colonies. And therefore, a country in Europe was referred to as a superior nation depending on the number of colonies. So they rushed to acquire many colonies to show power and might. So nationalism was another factor that led to European colonization of Africa, because they wanted to show might and power in Europe. So the competing force, in order to acquire colonies in Africa to show that they are very powerful, led to the colonization of Africa, among other factors. We have talked about strategic factors, like the Egyptian question. Entirely, Britain did not want to colonize Egypt, but they wanted to colonize some other parts of some colonies in Asia, the Far East. And therefore, the acquisition of Egypt provided a leeway, a shortcut via the Suez Canal in Egypt to the Far East, providing a shortcut to the Far East instead of going around West Africa, South Africa, then to the Far East. Remember, the Turks, the Arabs had closed the shortcut from Europe to the Far East, and they were very fierce. We call them the Turks. They were very fierce to these people, and therefore they wanted to come to Africa before they enter the Far East. That is called a strategic reason as to why Britain colonized Egypt, among other factors. So all these factors combined, and from the notes I've given you, you go through, you'll get so many factors. I've just mentioned a few. These factors were key motivations for European colonization of Africa. So when they came and declared different parts of Africa as their spheres of influence, they drew the boundaries, and therefore declaring these areas spheres of influence as their colonies. And what followed was the acquisition of these colonies and the establishment of the colonial rule or systems in Africa. For example, Kenya was colonized by the British. So they established the British colonial system or administration system in Kenya. French, for instance, colonized Senegal. They established their form of the colonial system of assimilation, later on association, in Senegal, among others. Now, class, this led to what we refer to as the European colonization of Africa. Now, Africans went through a lot during the establishment of these administrative systems. For example, in Kenya, the traditional systems that existed were overthrown. Remember, traditional systems like the Abawanga had their own kingdom. It was overthrown and they took over. And even those ones who resisted, like the Nandi, they were defeated because of the superiority in terms of the weapons they used. They were defeated. And even those ones who collaborated, like the Maasai, their territories were taken over. And what we are saying is that African continent lost their traditional systems were interfered with. That one aside, they also took over the fertile lands that belong to Africans. For example, in Kenya, we refer to them as the White Highlands or the Crown Land. That is the land that belonged to Africans in central Kenya, Mount Kenya region, that were very fertile for coffee plantation and other crops. They were taken. And where were the Africans taken to? They were taken to what we call the squatters, to infertile lands. So there was what we call land alienation, the taking over of African land, fertile land, and the Africans being pushed to what we call African reserves. So Africans lost land. They lost their traditional systems. Their leaders were reduced into mere chiefs, in powerless chiefs. Remember, they were very powerful. When we learned about the pre-colonial nations class, you remember, we talked about these leaders having all powers. But now, with the coming in of the Europeans, they were rendered powerless. These Africans, apart from being pushed to African reserves, they were forced to provide labor in European farms. Apart from that, apart from providing forced labor, they were also issued with kipande to wear around their necks, and therefore even their movement was curtailed by the Europeans. You were only allowed to work on a certain farm that belongs to that particular European. And therefore, even the movements of the European was curtailed. Of Africans were curtailed. Apart from this, there was also the issue of the taxation that happened in Africa. Africans who worked on these European farms were paid low wages. And apart from that, there was also the issue of taxation. Sorry for that interruption, class, we can proceed. That apart from being paid low wages, these Africans again were asked to pay the taxes, the breast tax, you can imagine, the poll tax. So whatever the Africans earned was hand to mouth. They were only paid little peanuts for a day survival. This is what Africans went through in the hands of the Europeans or during the colonization process. And this led to the agitation later on, agitation for their own rights. Maybe this one will be covered in our next topic class, when I'll be taking you through what we call African nationalism. Because there are these very reasons, the overtaxation, being paid low wages, yes, being issued with the kipande that curtail their movement, among other, the Africans losing their land to the Europeans, being pushed to the African reserves that were very infertile, among other hostile environment that Africans went through. These are the very reasons that led to African nationalism, the desire for self-independence, European colonization of Africa. And class, it was very tough. It was very tough. Africans went through a lot. And up to this point, class, what I've taught you is the European colonization. I've just touched a few points, but having said that, we cannot fail to look at the effects. And of course, I've already told you the effects, and majorly I've looked at maybe the negative ones. But among other effects or impact of European colonization of Africa, we cannot only look at the negatives. Perhaps also we can also discuss the positive ones. And up to this point, I don't know if the Odell team can help me so that the class becomes interactive. I want to know if you are able to tell me some of the positive impacts, apart from the negative that I've just mentioned. The European colonization did not just bring about negative impact, it had also positive impacts. So maybe I want to open this floor to all of us. One, maybe you can react to what I've just shared. James, I can see you are raising up your hand, and maybe say something and give us the impact of, yes?
I was saying the positive impact is the introduction of the new cash crops like coffee, tea, and pyrethrum.
Great. The introduction of new crops, and you just mentioned of pyrethrum and coffee. So that's great. Wasilwa, Daniel? Wasilwa, Daniel?
Okay, Europeans brought about Christianity.
Maybe the rest can mute so that we allow somebody, one person to respond. Class? Okay. Who is this raising? BCR 002823?
Yes, they brought about education.
Education, of course, establishment of missionaries by established. Oh, that's great. Another one?
Civilization.
Yes?
Civilization.
Civilization, like how? When you talk about civilization, can you elaborate on that, please?
Westernization.
Westernization, I like that. Because when you talk about civilization, that one I can still argue it from another perspective. But when you talk about westernization, that is, they brought about Western cultures to African cultures. Very good. Another one? Nyakwamba? Yes?
They constructed, it led to construction of simple roads within the African country.
Very, very good. For these people to exploit the interior of Africa, remember that is how the Kenya-Uganda Railway came into force. And of course, apart from now building the Kenya-Uganda Railway, they had to build the feeder roads that led to the interior parts of Africa. So that is a very important factor here, achievement for the Europeans that they were able to build. But remember, the building of these roads, the feeder roads, and even the railway was only based on the fact that it led to those areas where they wanted where the raw materials were. That is why even today you'll find some areas that are more developed than others because of the raw material aspect or factor. Yes, a great. Another one maybe.
In the field of
Yes.
Revolution
Naomi.
the spread of
Christianity.
Okay, we've talked of Christianity because of the missional factor. Okay, very, very well. Another one?
In the field
They
of health,
constructed.
they brought about new medicine.
Okay, she's talking of new medicine. I think because of the hospitals they build. The hospitals they build, yes. Thank you.
revolution of industries.
Yeah, evolution of industries. Industries came up, the processing industries came up. Thank you.
They also brought about economic growth.
Yes.
Cultural exchange.
Yeah. So we are talking about exchange in terms of what?
Cultural.
Pardon?
Culture.
Oh, culture exchange. Very good. I think there wasn't that much exchange. I think we had answered that one under westernization. There wasn't much that they learned from us, though we are the ones that copied and pasted. Okay, that's great. Another one?
New languages.
Okay, new languages were introduced, and that is why even today we speak the English, the Queen's language.
Excuse me, Daktari, can we say culture is a positive impact of the colonial as a result of them coming to Africa? But because there are some cultures that are not favoring our traditions as Africans. So
like
can we just
one?
put it in general?
Like which one? Like which
one? When the European came, they were discouraging marrying of many wives, and marrying of many wives, I don't see the bad effect of it.
So and that is interesting, and I want us to maybe discuss on that one. That we're saying that they introduced new cultures that perhaps and you are saying they were positive to Africans or they were negative to Africans.
Partly they were negative to Africans.
Like which one? Like which one?
Basically, the one I've mentioned, that of marrying many wives. You know, the Europeans were against that.
Yes.
But to Africans, it was as significant as it were also a measure of value and property the person have, because you cannot have a big family without anything to fill them.
That's great, and I like your argument. Yeah, true. They really interfered with our culture, and we've just mentioned, the issue of westernization to a larger extent cannot be justified, students, and that is why at times I teach an interesting course in 4th year called African historiography, where we really look at the Eurocentric writings class, and perhaps that is what the argument you're bringing on board, that the issue of westernization cannot be really wholesomely justified when for example, let's give a good example of the Maasai. Were they justified to tell us that female genital mutilation is wrong among the Maasai? Maybe I want to hear your opinions about it. I know today we say it's bad, but from the point of the Maasai people, was it wrong or right?
To my view, it was right, because when female was circumcised, actually, from my knowledge of understanding, it reduces that urge of you just want to sleep with many men. So at that point, maybe ilikuwa ina control the spread of certain diseases. Then watu walikuwa wanakuwa faithful to their partners, such that tukuwe na hiyo tamaa sana ya kutafuta tu
Jackson, very good, but they had a very good reason as to why they circumcised, and we just talked about the low libido comes about the circumcision of women. But then I want us to argue from the Maasai point of understanding. Why did they circumcise, for example? I know we have already agreed that it reduces the libido among the ladies, which is true. But what is the justification from the Maasai? Maybe just somebody, you don't have to be a Maasai. Yes? Anthony, I can see you want to say something? Hello? You can just unmute and say something.
Any
Yes.
Maasai can help us to understand
that. Jackson, you are fearing you are a Luo. Okay. And no problem. We
Yeah.
can still we can still get another person. You don't have to be a Maasai, but we are sharing knowledge class. We are sharing, so, and we are not victimizing anybody. We want just to justify from the African point. Manyasa, you want to say something, please? I can see you are raising up your hand.
The reason why Maasai they keep circumcising their girls because they want to preserve their culture from one generation to another.
Yeah, the culture aspect I agree, but there is a justification for that, Manyasa. There is another justification. Maybe. What is the main economic activity of the Maasai now? Let me help you answer that question. Naomi, you want to answer that? Respond?
For me, I can say why the Maasai circumcise their girls up to now. Number
Yes.
one is to maintain their culture. Number
Yes.
two, respect. Like when someone is being circumcised, now that is ready to get married.
Okay. Okay, thank you. There is, I'm giving you a hint on how to answer that one. BCR 0028, you want to respond to that? I can see DF 54. You want to say something? Ibrahim?
No, according to my own perspective,
yes,
I believe it is wrong for the Maasai to practice the FGM.
Yes.
Because it interferes with human rights.
Yes.
Because most of the time it causes a lot of bleeding. And pain, hence causes them to die.
Okay, but I've given you a hint on how to answer that question, and basically I was looking at the economic
I can try now.
Jackson, you're back.
I can try now on that.
Yes.
So after giving us the hint that Maasai are pastoralists.
Yes.
So you will find that sometimes Maasai they go away, far away from their homes. They leave their families back. So you can find when the husband went away for the pastoral service, anaacha bibi yake huko nyumbani nyuma. So hiyo kitu circumcision ina reduce libido. So wakati ameacha bibi yake huko nyuma, bibi yake hadi hatakuwa na hiyo tamaa ya kutafuta mwanaume mwingine. He will just try to maintain ule bwana yake arudi.
Thank you so much, Yakwamba. Jackson, that is the answer I was looking for. And these people were justified by then. That because you remember, these guys used to travel for even 5, 6, 7 months because of their pastoral kind of economy. They used to travel to, in fact, they used to cross to even Tanzania. And for that reason, you can imagine leaving a lady for over 6, 7 months, 8 months without coming back. So they were justified in that way. But I don't want to say here that it's still justified up to date because of what these people go through. And that is why the Kenyan government has really been in action to stop it, because it has its own negative impact to our ladies. So I'm not justifying female circumcision here, but from their point of perspective, and that is why they did, we have justified. So that is it. So we are saying that basically the European colonization in Africa had many myriads of negative impact to Africa. But apart from that, we have also listed the positive sides. I know when you go through my notes, you'll be able to identify more of this, the positive and the negatives. It's important. I want to stop at that point, class. And today, basically what I've taught you about, maybe I'll give you an opportunity to say something. And see Luke and Naomi are raising up their hands. Maybe I'll give you an opportunity later on. I just want to do a summary of what we've learned, class. We started with the European colonization of Africa. I laid the backbone of European colonization of Africa from the time of industrialization, the need for raw material, the acquisition of raw materials, the acquisition of colonies, the scramble of African nations. And then later on, this led to the Berlin Conference that brought about the partition of Africa. And after the partition of Africa, now the establishment of colonial rule in Africa, and what Africans went through. And this topic is laying the basis for the next topic that we learn next week about African nationalism, and factors that led to African nationalism. I've already shared that a number of factors, a number of things that Africans went through in the hands of the Europeans is what brought about the agitation for self-rule, and this is what we call African nationalism. So I've told you briefly what the motivation of of European colonization of Africa, the major reason for European colonization of Africa, among other motivations. And we have looked at the impact of European colonization of Africa. Up to that point, class, is there any question, any clarification, maybe an observation? Just one or two, then we end the session, please. And I want to maybe say, okay, Dennis, you want to say something? Just an observation, maybe, from what I've taught today? I can see Professor George K. You want to say something? Nyakwamba Jackton.
Yeah, I'm asking, what is a breast tax? Breast tax.
Now, that one, to some extent, it was given that name, but to some extent, you see the ladies, for those ones whose breasts were protruding, started protruding, they were in fact forced to, just like the poll tax, it was paid on what? On the number of houses. This one, some extent, and in quotes, was pegged on that these ladies also had to pay tax. Tumetenga. Huyu jamaa wa tumetenga anabeba mkono, sema tuone. Tumetenga. Yes. Get it? Oh, bwana, you guys, mumetenga nini? Serikali imekataa. Luke Bakoko, yes?
Yeah, sir, I wanted to ask this question. You have said that the European, after the Berlin Conference, the European now begin their colonization. Then they mark the boundaries. Then I want a clarification. Who marked the boundaries of the continent?
Of the continent itself, the entire African continent? Or within the countries within Africa?
Continents.
Maybe you're not clear. Maybe come up again. Maybe just to a quick one on that. Remember, we said the Berlin Conference is the one that laid the procedure of European colonization of Africa. And therefore, any country that claimed any part of Africa this part of Africa was referred to as sphere of influence. And therefore, this sphere of influence was to be occupied. So when they came to occupy, after the Berlin Conference of 1885 in February, they came and began drawing the boundaries within the continent. The continent existed. The continent itself existed before European colonization, but it existed as one, and within it we had the pre-colonial nations that we learned. I don't know up to that extent. Have I answered your question? So the process of colonization after the Berlin Conference, the partitioning, because partitioning, when you talk about partitioning itself, to partition means to subdivide between or among in an organized way, which is the opposite of now the scramble and partition, the scramble itself. The scramble was disorderly, but now the partition is the organized form and following a certain procedure, dividing amongst themselves. So that's when we had now the country, the nation states coming into place. Maybe the last one, even an observation of what we have learned today is important. Okay. Having said that, class, I wish to end the session, but I want to insist. I'm seeing only a few people who are joining my class. I want to tell you that, like today, I've taught history from the point of a historian. Much of what I've taught is not in the notes that I've just shared here. But I know any bright student, because this is the history that I have it and I work with it. I really share a lot when I'm teaching like this. So those ones who are just waiting and sitting back and saying, we have the notes he shared, they'll really miss out, because much of even what I've said comes from such interaction. So please tell those people who are staying off and they're not coming to class because they have the notes. Tell them it is not well with them. Yeah, and today we are going to have a cut in the evening, about 5 marks. Maybe the last one, James Wanjawa, you have something? Wanjawa or even BCR or Mugema, you have something? I want to allow you.
You have already answered me concerning the cut. Hello?
Yes.
Yes. I was just asking the question concerning the cut because at the beginning of the class you were saying something about cut and there was no network. There was a problem with the network.
Okay, it will be there from 5 and it will be just about 5 questions or 6, 5 marks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Mugema, the last one?
No, sir. It has already been answered.
Okay. Ama nimewahangaisha sana kwa history. Unajua pia mnasema mwalimu alituhangaisha.
Uko sawa sana.
Okay, thank you.
Well, doctor.
Thank you. Okay, see you guys.
Thank you, Mr. Can you have a makeup cut for those who meet?
Again,
Trap exam here.